The fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of an era. It begins, as late-night history stories often do, not with the roar of a crowd or the thunder of an army, but with an almost uncomfortable silence. A kind of silence that sits heavy in the air, like the quiet between two people who once shared everything, but now can't even agree on who gets the last chair in the room. It is the silence of Berlin, in the early hours of November 9th, 1989. A city split, not only by ideology or politics or even barbed wire, but by fatigue, by decades of it. And on this cold autumn night, the wall that once screamed division now stands awkwardly still, as if it senses that history has shown up early and hasn't bothered to knock. Imagine it. The streetlights buzz with that faint yellow hum that only East Berlin bulbs seem to produce. The air is cold enough to sting, but not enough to bite. Somewhere in the distance, a faint rumble. Maybe a truck, maybe just the U-Bahn wheezing through its nightly routine. And beneath it all, the quiet murmurs of people who don't yet know they're about to rewrite the world. People who only stepped out to see what the commotion was about. People who just wanted to check if the rumor, that absurd, impossible, laughably optimistic rumor, could somehow be true. But of course, this story doesn't begin here. Major historical moments never do. They merely arrive here. The fall of the Berlin Wall was not an event. It was an explosion. And explosions, as any good physicist or politician will tell you, require pressure. In this case, 40 solid years of it. So before we stand with those Berliners in the 1980s, shivering under their coats and clutching radios that were suddenly reporting the impossible, we must travel back to ruined streets, exhausted countries, and the uneasy peace that followed World War II. Because to understand why a wall fell, we must understand why it was ever built. And so, as the imaginary documentary camera pulls back, gliding over the nighttime cityscape like a sleepy raven looking for a place to perch, we drift backward through time, through smoke, rubble, speeches, and treaties, right into the heart of a Europe that was trying to piece itself together with hands that were still shaking. This is the story of the Berlin Wall, yes, but it is also the story of fear, pride, stubbornness, and eventually exhaustion. The story of an era that began with fire and ended, fittingly, with a crack, concrete breaking under the weight of human hope. So, sit back, make some tea if you must, and let's wander, slowly and deliberately, into the long shadow before the wall. The year is 1945. Europe exhaled shakily after 6 years of violence so immense that even historians sometimes struggle to describe it without sliding into metaphor. Berlin, once the proud heart of the German Reich, now lay in ruins that looked almost biblical. Entire neighborhoods flattened, streets twisted like broken ribs, buildings gutted and charred, standing only because gravity hadn't yet remembered to finish the job. Soviet soldiers marched through the debris. American and British troops set up temporary command posts in buildings that were missing entire walls. And somewhere in the middle of this shattered city, 4 victorious powers, who trusted each other roughly as much as hungry wolves trust one another at dinner time, were expected to create a functioning system of governance. What could possibly go wrong? Berlin was carved into 4 sectors: Soviet, American, British, French. At first, the arrangement meant to symbolize cooperation. They said, "We defeated a monster together. Surely we can rebuild a city together." But cooperation is difficult when your partner believes the entire economic foundation of your worldview is fundamentally evil. You know, small disagreements. The Americans pushed capitalism. The Soviets pushed socialism. The British tried to mediate through polite annoyance. The French mostly hoped everyone would just stop destroying Europe, please, for once. And Berlin, poor, battered Berlin, sat right in the middle of it all, geographically surrounded by Soviet-held East Germany, but politically claimed by the entire victorious alliance. It was a geopolitical trap waiting to happen, a historical mousetrap baited with ideology and wired to detonate the moment anyone tugged too firmly. And they tugged, because while Berlin lay in ruins, the seeds of the Cold War sprouted quickly. The Western powers rebuilt their sectors with market reforms and aid packages. The Soviets rebuilt theirs with centralized control and the iron certainty that capitalist influence must be kept far, far away. Both sides insisted they were saving Germany from the other. Both sides were convinced they were right. And Berliners, stuck between competing utopias, did what Berliners have always done. They tried to live, to survive, to make sense of the madness around them. But then came 1948. The Soviets, irritated that the Western powers were reforming their sectors with suspicious independence, and even more offensively, a new currency, decided to solve the problem in the bluntest way possible. They cut off all land access to West Berlin. No trucks, no trains, no food, nothing. Their logic was simple: starve West Berlin into submission. The Western response? Fly in everything the city needed: milk, coal, medicine, even candy, because apparently Western pilots believe that nothing says capitalist superiority than dropping chocolate bars from the sky. Children cheered, Stalin glared, and after nearly a year of this aerial stubbornness, the blockade failed. West Berlin survived. The message was clear: neither side was leaving. The Cold War thickened like clay. In the 1950s, East Germany, which would become the German Democratic Republic, a name as honest as calling Iraq a soft pillow, struggled with weak productivity, political repression, and citizens who increasingly concluded that life was significantly better on the other side of that increasingly tense border. And here's the problem: Berlin still had a hole in the fence. You could walk from the Soviet sector to the Western one in minutes. So East Germans did, by the hundreds of thousands. By 1961, nearly 3.5 million people had fled east to west through Berlin, draining the East German workforce like water leaking from a cracked bowl. For East Germany's government, this was, how do we put it, inconvenient. A state that loses its citizens faster than it loses patients is not a stable state. Something had to be done. And so, on a hot August night in 1961, while most of the city slept, dozens of East German soldiers and workers began unrolling barbed wire, digging trenches, and hammering posts into the ground. By morning, Berliners awoke to find their city sliced down the middle. Families divided, streets split, front doors opening into foreign territory. The Berlin Wall was born, not with ceremony, but with the cold efficiency of a government desperate to keep its people inside. In the years that followed, the wall grew, taller, stronger, crueler. Watchtowers rose like concrete sentinels. Guards were ordered to shoot anyone who tried to escape. And escape attempts continued, because no wall, no matter how tall or brutal, could fully contain human longing. But this story is not about the rise of the wall. It is about its fall. And walls, as we know, don't fall easily, not unless pushed by forces too large to ignore. Over the next decades, pressure built: political stagnation in the East, economic struggles, dissident movements whispering, then shouting, Soviet leaders who preferred reform to repression, and a growing realization among the East Bloc that the old system was cracking under its own weight. By the late 1980s, Berlin was once again a city buzzing with rumors, tension, and something dangerously close to hope. The stage was set. The actors were ready. All that remained was the spark. Which brings us, slowly, inevitably, back to that cold November night, where Berlin awaits, where history lingers, where the wall stands unaware that sunrise will never look the same again.
The long unraveling, from stagnation to sparks, 1950s to 1980s. History rarely turns on a single moment. More often, it moves like a glacier, slow, immense, and absolutely determined to crush whatever lies in its path. And the decades leading to the fall of the Berlin Wall were very much that kind of movement, cold, heavy, and painfully slow. The wall may have fallen in one night, but the system behind it crumbled over 30 long years. So let's drift forward from the chaos of the 1950s into the strange gray stillness of the 1960s and 70s, an era where the world was caught in its own staring contest. capitalism and communism glaring at each other across borders and oceans. The Cold War had settled into a kind of tense routine, the geopolitical equivalent of roommates who cannot stand each other but refuse to move out. And in the middle of this uncomfortable arrangement, Berlin stayed split, cold, and restless. To understand how East Germany slowly unraveled, we need to picture the everyday world behind the wall. Not the speeches, not the leaders, not the military parades, but the streets, the apartments, the small rituals of daily life. Imagine a city where the lights dim slightly at night, not because it's atmospheric, but because the power grid is always a tiny bit overwhelmed. Where grocery stores are lined with jars and cans, but lack half the things printed on their own labels. Where lines form not outside clubs or concerts, but outside butcher shops because someone heard there might be actual meat today. It wasn't ideal. And yet, life continued. Families grew, children played, couples fell in love, complained about their landlords, and tried not to gossip too loudly about politics, because one never knew who might be listening. After all, the Stasi, East Germany's secret police, had a habit of turning anyone or everyone into informants. Neighbors, coworkers, distant cousins, that guy who fixed your bicycle once in 1971. All potential spies. The atmosphere wasn't just politically repressive, it was suffocatingly paranoid. But even paranoia becomes routine if you live with it long enough. Daily life in the 60s and 70s was a kind of muted existence, predictable, contained, and painted in the slightly washed-out colors of a world where possibility itself felt rationed. The government called this stability, citizens called it boredom, and economists had another word entirely: stagnation. Because behind the gray buildings and the neat parades lay a growing problem. The East German economy simply wasn't keeping up. The Soviet model, built on heavy industry and long-term planning, excelled in producing steel and concrete, but struggled dramatically in producing things people actually wanted. When your citizens start dreaming wistfully about West German shampoo, something has gone terribly wrong. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, West Berlin was, well, not perfect, but undeniably alive. Neon signs glowed, jazz bars hummed, department stores overflowed with items that looked almost mythical to East Berliners. Jeans, oranges in winter, televisions with more than 2 channels, and yes, a very suspicious amount of Coca-Cola. The contrast didn't require propaganda. It was visible from rooftops. And this is the part where any sensible government might think to itself, maybe we should lighten up, invest in consumer goods, loosen restrictions, and win people back with quality of life improvements. But East Germany's leadership, stern, paranoid, and deeply committed to their ideological blueprint, responded instead with more surveillance, more speeches, and more state control. Because of course they did. Still, even in an atmosphere this carefully controlled, cracks began to appear. People always find cracks. That is one of the fundamental truths of human history. No matter how tall a wall you build, someone will walk up to it, squint, and say, what if I tried to get around it? By the 1970s, escape attempts became more elaborate. Tunnels dug under the wall, cars modified with hidden compartments, hot air balloons sewn together from bed sheets, swimming attempts across rivers patrolled by armed guards. People risked, and too often lost, their lives trying to reach the West. The East German government responded with stricter border security, higher walls, more guard towers, and orders that left no room for hesitation. The wall by the late 1970s was not just a barrier, it was a fortress. A 12-foot concrete ribbon lined with barbed wire, death strips, tripwire-fitted fences, motion sensors, sand traps, and guards watching from above with rifles ready. A prison walled for an entire nation. It should have been impenetrable, and yet the cracks kept forming. Because while the physical wall became stronger, the ideological wall behind it weakened. Ideas flowed through radio broadcasts, smuggled books, visiting relatives, cassette tapes, and televised soccer matches that West Germans conveniently played at volumes the East couldn't easily drown out. And then in the early 1980s, the world shifted again, softly at first, like a tremor under the surface. To witness the start of the end, we must glide our imaginary camera eastward across the forests and factories of the East Bloc and into the heart of the Soviet Union, where a man named Mikhail Gorbachev was about to do something terribly unusual for a Soviet leader: change things. Gorbachev didn't want to dismantle the Soviet system, he wanted to save it. But in trying to repair the machine, he accidentally loosened all the bolts. His policies of perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost openness were meant to modernize the rigid, inefficient Soviet model. Instead, they inspired debate, emboldened activists, irritated hardliners, and generated expectations that could no longer be contained. And East Germany? East Germany was furious. Its leader, Erich Honecker, had the political flexibility of a granite countertop. He distrusted reform, distrusted debate, and distrusted the idea that a socialist state might fix itself by being honest about its mistakes. For him, the wall remained a necessary, eternal barrier against fascism, a phrase that began sounding increasingly ridiculous each year. But the world wasn't waiting for his approval. Reform movements spread across Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia. Protests swelled. Borders loosened. Old fears began to peel away. And suddenly, East Germans realized something electrifying. The Eastern Bloc was changing, and East Germany wasn't. Which brings us to summer 1989, a season that must have felt like the world's strangest weather pattern. To the south, Hungary quietly opened its border with Austria, creating, unintentionally or not, a hole in the Iron Curtain. East Germans traveled to Hungary under the guise of vacation and then just walked west. It was a loophole that grew into a flood. East German authorities panicked. West German diplomats improvised. Hungary shrugged. Other countries joined in, and by autumn the situation grew absurd. East German embassies across Eastern Europe filled with refugees begging for permission to leave. Footage of their cramped, desperate living conditions played on West German TV, and East Germans watching through illegal antennas saw the truth. People like them, in real time, choosing freedom at any cost. And once that desire spreads, it becomes unstoppable. Back in East Germany, protests swelled. Tens of thousands in Leipzig marched with candles, singing and chanting for reform. What began as quiet, tentative demonstrations turned into weekly gatherings. Rivers of humanity flowing through city streets, too large and too peaceful to crush without igniting a catastrophe. The government hesitated, the police hesitated, even the army hesitated. The unthinkable was happening. The people were no longer afraid. As we drift toward the closing months of 1989, imagine the atmosphere of East Germany. Not explosive, but trembling. A nation holding its breath. A government pretending nothing was wrong, while everything was visibly, undeniably wrong. A wall built to stop history was now surrounded by it. Honecker, worn and increasingly irrelevant, stepped down in October. His successor, Egon Krenz, tried to present himself as a reformer, but his promises sounded like they'd been translated poorly from a language no one spoke anymore. The country was collapsing faster than anyone could draft new slogans. Rumors spread, borders shifted, foreign news seeped through the cracks. And then in early November, something small happened, something technical, something bureaucratic, something that if the universe had been even slightly less mischievous, would have remained a minor footnote in Cold War history.
The night everything changed. November 9th, 1989. History often arrives disguised as confusion. It rarely sends a letter ahead of time announcing its plans. It simply walks in, uninvited, while everyone is still trying to figure out who's supposed to bring the snacks to the meeting. And on the night of November 9th, 1989, history barged into East Berlin wearing the expression of someone who's about to flip the table over. Not out of anger, but because no one is paying attention anymore. To understand this night, this absurd, chaotic, gorgeous night, we have to slow the film down. Let's step into a dimly lit room in East Berlin, the press center of the Socialist Unity Party. Cigarette smoke hangs in the air so thick it might have its own political opinions. The chairs are uncomfortable in that distinctly Eastern Bloc way. Functional, unsympathetic, and likely older than most of the journalists sitting on them. On the stage sits Günter Schabowski, the government spokesman who looks like a man who hasn't slept well in several years. It's early evening, and the room feels ordinary. News conferences in East Germany were usually predictable affairs, carefully scripted, monotonous, and so devoid of surprises that attending them felt a bit like watching paint dry on concrete. But tonight, the script is missing, or rather, incomplete, or perhaps just badly explained depending on which official you believe. Schabowski shuffles through his notes. He looks weary. Journalists shift in their seats, and then, with all the ceremonial enthusiasm of reading a shopping list, Schabowski announces a new regulation. A soft murmur goes through the room. Travel from East Germany to the West, he says, will now be permitted under certain conditions. Applications can be processed more easily. Restrictions are being loosened. This alone would have been big, huge even. But then comes the moment, the one historians play back like a favorite scene from a beloved movie. An Italian journalist raises his hand. He asks, "When does this new rule take effect?" Schabowski blinks. He looks down at his notes again. He looks up. He hesitates. Just long enough for the fate of a nation to hang awkwardly in the air. "As far as I know," he says slowly, "it takes effect immediately." Now let's be clear, this was not true. Not remotely. The policy was supposed to begin the next day, after procedures and controls had been established. But Schabowski didn't know that. And so, on live television, in a moment of bureaucratic improvisation that would make any government official wake up screaming decades later, he casually unlocked the entire border. Immediately. That word traveled faster than any bullet that had ever been fired at the wall. Journalists scrambled for telephones, news stations cut to urgent alerts, radios buzzed with urgent whispers, and East Berliners, huddled around their televisions in cramped apartments, stared at each other in disbelief. Did he just say, immediately? Wait, can we go? Now imagine the confusion spreading not in a neat line, but like a shockwave, rippling through the city's gray streets. People grabbed their coats, people called their friends, people walked out of their buildings not because they were sure, but because they needed it to be true. After decades of borders, checkpoints, interrogations, and visas stamped with suspicion, the idea that the gates might suddenly be open felt almost laughably impossible. But hope does strange things to people. Let's follow them, slowly, step by step, to the Bornholmer Strasse crossing, one of the main checkpoints between East and West Berlin. It's cold outside. The air is thin and sharp. It tastes like November and uncertainty. Streetlights glow in that hazy orange halo that East Berlin perfected long before Instagram filters tried to imitate it. A few people approach the checkpoint, then a few dozen, then hundreds. The guards, stationed in their booths, stare out at the growing crowd, and the crowd stares back. Both groups look equally confused, which is saying something because East German border guards were trained to appear intimidating even when they didn't know how to pronounce the word intimidating. People ask to cross, guards ask for permits, people say there's a new rule, guards say they haven't heard anything, and nobody knows what's true. Phones start ringing in the guardhouse. Orders come in, conflicting, contradictory, increasingly panicked. Don't let anyone through. Process them one at a time. Send them home. Allow emergency travel only. Wait for new instructions. Hold your position. Do nothing. Do everything. It is a symphony of uncertainty, a bureaucratic meltdown, a masterpiece of indecision. Meanwhile, the crowd keeps growing. The checkpoint is now surrounded by thousands of people, men, women, teenagers. Elderly neighbors bundled in heavy coats, young couples holding hands, entire families with toddlers half asleep in their arms. They're cold, excited, nervous, hopeful, restless. And then slowly, the mood shifts. The crowd begins to chant, not violently, not angrily, but insistently. Open the gate! Open the gate! Open the gate! The guards look at each other. They look at the crowd. They look at the phones, which keep ringing like alarm bells announcing the collapse of an era. Their training tells them to maintain control. Their instincts tell them the situation is slipping beyond control. And their hearts, well, that's harder to guess. But one suspects that even they felt it. A change in the air. A tipping point. The sense that history had decided to use them as background characters. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Yeager, the officer in charge at Bornholmer Strasse, faces an impossible decision. He can't disperse the crowd. He can't use force, not against thousands of peaceful citizens who might include his own neighbors. And he can't stall forever. Something has to give. He hesitates. He waits. He listens to the chants. And then, just before 11:30 p.m., exhausted and out of options, he gives the order that will echo through the world. Open the barrier. Not because the government told him to, but because the people demanded it. Imagine the sound. A metallic clank, a heavy gate shifting, the creak of machinery built to hold back a nation. And then, like water bursting through a cracked dam, the people surge forward, not running, not storming, but just flowing, laughing, crying, holding their breath as they step onto ground they've been forbidden to touch for 28 long years. West Berliners gather on the other side, cheering and clapping, some with champagne they absolutely did not expect to use on an average Thursday night. Strangers hug like old friends, cameras flash. A man pops open a bottle of sparkling wine and pours it into a paper cup for a woman he's never met. Someone starts playing music from a portable radio. Someone else climbs atop the wall, helping others up. It is messy, uncoordinated, overwhelming, human. Checkpoint after checkpoint opens. Crowds flood through. Joy spills into the cold night like the brightest, warmest light the city has seen in decades. And it keeps going. And going. And going. Across Berlin, people climb onto the wall. Thousands of them, like fireflies landing on a sleeping giant. They dance. They cheer. They wave flags. They hold hands and stomp their feet to keep warm. They chip away at the concrete with hammers, screwdrivers, keys, anything they can find. Little pieces break off, falling like gray, chalky snowflakes. For the first time in decades, Berlin is whole. Not officially, not politically, but emotionally, spiritually, in the way that matters most. The wall, still standing, is now irrelevant. Take a slow breath. Let's zoom out. From above, from the imagined camera suspended in the night sky, Berlin glows in patches of gold and white. The Brandenburg Gate stands illuminated. The wall, stretching across the city like a scar, is covered with silhouettes of people celebrating on top of it. Beneath them, streets overflow with laughter and disbelief. It is not a peaceful scene. It is not a chaotic one. It is something else entirely. It is a city waking up. It is a people unchained. It is the exact moment an era ends. Not with war, not with a speech, not with a treaty, but with the simple, unstoppable force of human hope. And somewhere, hours later, as dawn begins to brush the edges of the sky with a pale gray glow, Berlin is still awake. The city has been waiting 28 years for this night. Sleep can...
The morning after. A country wakes up to a new world, 1990. History loves drama in the night, but it also has a habit of leaving a mess by morning. There is something quietly comical about how revolutions tend to unfold. Fireworks and tears at midnight, followed by paperwork, confusion, and very tired politicians at sunrise. And the morning after the Berlin Wall fell was exactly that. A city blinking awake, wondering if it had dreamt the whole thing. Let's begin in the early hours of November 10th, 1989. The sky over Berlin is pale and washed out, the kind of gray that makes you wonder if the sun is running late or simply doesn't feel like showing up today. The streets are littered with footprints, empty bottles and confetti made unintentionally from chipped bits of concrete. Thousands of people are still awake. Some are still celebrating. Some have gone home to collapse on sofas they barely recognized because the adrenaline hadn't worn off enough to let them think. And some are quiet, sitting by windows, staring out over a city that suddenly feels bigger, more open, almost frightening in its newness. East Berlin is strangely calm. People walk to work out of habit, not fully convinced their daily routines don't still apply. Streetcars rattle past as usual, state-owned factories fire up their machines, children are sent to school. A teacher standing in front of a chalkboard pauses before writing the date. She wonders, just for a heartbeat, if she should add an asterisk. Something happened last night, something enormous, but no one quite knows what to call it yet. And across the city, in the offices of the East German government, what remains of it, officials sit frozen in disbelief, replaying television footage they cannot quite process. Their country's most defining structure, their ideological centerpiece, had been undermined not by military assault or political negotiation, but by a press conference misunderstanding and a crowd large enough to outweigh the will of the state. It is, objectively, hilarious, in a tragic, historic, end of an era kind of way. But while East German officials are still staring at the ruins of their authority, something else is happening in the West. Something louder, brighter, and considerably more caffeinated. West Berlin wakes up like a kid on Christmas morning who heard Santa crash into the living room at 2 a.m. People gather again along the wall, this time with tools. Big tools. Saws, drills, pickaxes that look like they were borrowed from a medieval museum. Journalists shove microphones toward anyone with a pulse. Tourists flood in with cameras. Street musicians arrive with guitars and accordions. Vendors, because capitalists always know an opportunity when they see one, set up stands selling wall chunks, postcards, pretzels, and beer at prices that would make a medieval king faint. By midday, the wall looks less like a barrier and more like a massive, crumbling art project covered in tourists, dust, and optimistic vandalism. Meanwhile, East Berliners continue pouring into the West, now in daylight. Some are tentative, walking slowly over the border as if they expect someone to shout at them. Others rush forward, beaming, laughing, clutching family members' arms tightly. Most are greeted by West Berliners who stand on sidewalks holding flowers, candy, or simply open arms. Banks open special booths to distribute the famous welcome money, a small sum given to each East German visitor so they can enjoy their newly accessible capitalist playground. And enjoy it they do. Supermarkets become wonderlands of unfamiliar abundance. Electronic stores become temples of shimmering possibility. Shoe stores, clothing outlets, even simple bakeries fill with East Berliners who examine the offerings with a mixture of delight, disbelief, and quiet heartbreak. Because joy and tragedy often sit closer than we like to admit. For many, the West feels magical. For others, it feels like looking into a mirror that reveals every deprivation they've lived through. A woman in her 60s walks into a grocery store and cries because she's never seen so many types of cheese. A young man buys bananas for the first time since he was a child. A mechanic stares at a West German car display and wonders how his own factory fell so far behind. These are small moments, tiny emotional fissures that widen slowly into a larger truth. The two Germanys may have touched hands again last night, but they had not yet learned how to stand together. And this brings us to 1990,
a year that felt like a roller coaster built by a committee of people who had never agreed on anything in their lives. The collapse of the East German regime happened rapidly, but the rebuilding of a country, that is slow, complicated work. And the German leadership, on both sides of the border, was now stuck with the monumental task of figuring out what came next. Let's step into the office of West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, who, upon reviewing the news on November 10th, likely had the political equivalent of a caffeine overdose. Kohl saw an opportunity not merely for celebration, but for unification, real unification, the kind that would take legal finesse, diplomatic tact, mountains of cash, and apparently the ability to talk very quickly to half of Europe. His plan? Reunify the two Germanys within 1 year. Historians later called this timeline ambitious. East German leaders called it sudden. Western allies called it, wait, what? And the Soviet Union called it, hold on, we didn't sign up for this. But Kohl pushed forward, and the world, still dizzy from the pace of change sweeping Eastern Europe, eventually agreed. Behind the scenes, diplomats worked day and night. The 2+4 negotiations began, involving the two Germanys and the four major Allied powers from World War II, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union. It was essentially a meeting to ask, hey, remember how we divided Germany 45 years ago? Well, about that. Miraculously, slowly, and with a few dramatic moments that nearly derailed everything, agreements formed. Borders were recognized, rights were acknowledged, conditions were set, and Germany inched toward reunification. But politics was only part of the story. On the ground, daily life in East Germany dissolved at a breathtaking pace. State-run institutions collapsed. Factories that had once been the pride of the socialist economy shuttered as they proved incompatible with global markets. Thousands lost their jobs. Entire industries evaporated. And as the East German mark, the mark, was replaced by the West German Deutschmark, prices and wages shifted with dizzying speed. For many East Germans, the fall of the wall brought promise. But promise, as always, walks hand in hand with loss. People felt unmoored, identity shaken. A way of life, flawed, restricted, but familiar, vanished overnight. A teacher wondered if her training still mattered. A doctor faced sudden competition from modernized clinics. A mechanic stared at a West German car display and wondered how his own factory fell so far behind. These are small moments, tiny emotional fissures that widen slowly into a larger truth. The two Germanys may have touched hands again last night, but they had not yet learned how to stand together. And this brings us to 1990. A year that felt like a roller coaster built by a committee of people who had never agreed on anything in their lives. The collapse of the East German regime happened rapidly, but the rebuilding of a country, that is slow, complicated work. And the German leadership on both sides of the border was now stuck with the monumental task of figuring out what came next. Let's step into the office of West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, who, upon reviewing the news on November 10th, likely had the political equivalent of a caffeine overdose. Kohl saw an opportunity not merely for celebration, but for unification, real unification, the kind that would take legal finesse, diplomatic tact, mountains of cash, and apparently the ability to talk very quickly to half of Europe. His plan? Unify the two Germanys within 1 year. Historians later called this timeline ambitious. East German leaders called it sudden. Western allies called it, wait, what? And the Soviet Union called it, hold on, we didn't sign up for this. But Kohl pushed forward, and the world, still dizzy from the pace of change sweeping Eastern Europe, eventually agreed. Behind the scenes, diplomats worked day and night. The 2+4 negotiations began, involving the two Germanys and the four major Allied powers from World War II. The United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union. It was essentially a meeting to ask, hey, remember how we divided Germany 45 years ago? Well, about that. Miraculously, slowly, and with a few dramatic moments that nearly derailed everything, agreements formed. Borders were recognized, rights were acknowledged, conditions were set, and Germany inched toward reunification. But politics was only part of the story. On the ground, daily life in East Germany dissolved at a breathtaking pace. State-run institutions collapsed. Factories that had once been the pride of the socialist economy shuttered as they proved incompatible with global markets. Thousands lost their jobs. Entire industries evaporated. And as the East German mark, the Mark, was replaced by the West German Deutschmark, prices and wages shifted with dizzying speed. For many East Germans, the fall of the wall brought promise, but promise, as always, walks hand in hand with loss. People felt unmoored, identity shaken. A way of life flawed, restricted, but familiar, vanished overnight. A teacher wondered if her training still mattered. A doctor faced sudden competition from modernized clinics.
A factory worker found himself skilled at a job that no longer existed. Even street names changed. Statues fell. Institutions disappeared as quickly as they had once appeared. It was not just a political transformation. It was a cultural shedding, a social rebirth, a painful one. And yet, through the confusion and growing pains, something beautiful persisted. Connection. Families reunited. Old friends found each other. People traveled freely, discovering cities they had only seen on forbidden maps. A young woman visited West Berlin's Kurfürstendamm shopping boulevard for the first time and proclaimed it like stepping into a movie. A West Berliner drove across the border just to eat his favorite East Berlin pastry again, something he hadn't tasted since childhood. A middle-aged couple crossed the former death strip together, hand in hand, whispering, "We never thought we'd live to see this." These were small reunifications, personal ones, the kind that never make it into official treaties, but matter far more. As months passed, the wall itself became a curiosity, a relic whose days were obviously numbered. Crews dismantled it section by section, though not without difficulty. The concrete was stubborn, the rebar was dense, the symbolism was heavy. Eventually, only fragments remained: souvenirs, museum pieces, modern art. Some stood in distant cities like Los Angeles or Seoul. Others became coffee table decorations of questionable taste. But most disappeared into history's quiet archive, leaving behind empty space where divisions once stood. And then came the day, October 3rd, 1990. Germany became one nation again. The ceremony was simple, surprisingly gentle. Flags were raised, crowds gathered, bells rang. Politicians gave speeches that no one would remember word for word, but all would remember for their tone: hopeful, proud, tinged with disbelief. There were fireworks that night, bright colors exploding over Berlin, reflecting off windows and remnants of the wall. People clapped, cheered, hugged. Children waved little flags. Tourists tried to get the perfect camera angle. And somewhere in an apartment overlooking the street, an elderly man who had lived through the Third Reich, the division, and the Cold War sat quietly by the window and whispered to himself, "Finally." Germany was whole. Not healed. Healing takes longer, but whole. And in the center of the city, beneath the echoes of celebration, something else lingered. A question. What does a nation do with freedom once it finally has it? The answer, as we will see, unfolds slowly over decades. But to get there, we must first explore the weight of legacy, the shadows left behind, and the transformation of a people learning to live without a wall.
Aftermath and legacy. The ghosts that remained. When the wall finally cracked open and Berliners spilled through the border like a tidal wave of disbelief, the world celebrated as if history itself had decided to throw a surprise party. The cameras recorded tears, hugs, champagne, and the unsteady laughter of people who suddenly discovered that the impossible had been downgraded to Tuesday evening. But after the music died down, after the fireworks fizzled into the cold November sky, and after the Western press packed up their equipment and headed home, there came a much quieter chapter, one that didn't make for triumphant newspaper headlines. Because for all its symbolic glory, the fall of the Berlin Wall also exposed something far more complicated. The fact that history never ends cleanly. It never signs its name at the bottom of the page and leaves. No, history lingers, like cigarette smoke in a closed bar. And East Germany was full of that smoke. Stories unfinished, wounds unhealed, hopes tangled with anxieties. In the days following November 9th, Berlin became a city trying to remember what it felt like to breathe. East Berliners wandered through the glittering West like visitors from another century. Some walked slowly, as if afraid the ground would disappear beneath their feet. Others rushed into department stores with the urgency of people who had known scarcity for too long. Even more simply stood on street corners, staring at neon signs and supermarket aisles overflowing with a dizzying abundance of things. There were bananas, real ones, not tin substitutes. There were tropical fruits, electronics, denim jeans that didn't feel like sandpaper. And of course, there were bars and cafes, buzzing with a level of freedom that felt almost absurd. But beneath the surface celebration was an ocean of uncertainty. East Germany had collapsed not with a cataclysmic bang, but with an exhausted sigh. And that meant its citizens were left in a strange limbo. They had crossed into a new world, but they hadn't arrived as equals. They arrived as guests at a party that had started without them. Meanwhile, West Germany, wealthy, industrial, and confident, found itself suddenly responsible for integrating millions of people whose entire lives had been shaped by a system that no longer existed. It was a monumental task, like trying to merge two families who had been separated for decades and now discovered they didn't quite speak the same emotional language anymore. Still, the euphoria carried them forward. In March 1990, East Germany held its first free elections. Campaign posters plastered the streets, and political parties that had been forbidden for 40 years suddenly appeared like mushrooms after rain. People debated passionately in cafes, on buses, in the queues that still formed in old state-run stores. Democracy was messy, loud, imperfect, and they were loving it. But in the quiet corners of East Berlin, reality was settling in like winter frost. Factories that had been the pride of the GDR's planned economy suddenly couldn't compete with Western industries. Entire sectors collapsed almost overnight, and unemployment, unknown under socialism, became a grim new household word. Streets that once echoed with the rhythmic certainty of state-controlled work hours now carried the uneasy silence of economic transition. Some felt liberated. Some felt abandoned. Many felt both at the same time, which is perfectly reasonable when you watch your entire world rearrange itself in a matter of months. But among all the adjustments and anxieties, there remained one issue, one enormous, heavy moral issue that Germany simply could not avoid: the legacy of the Stasi. Ah yes, the Ministry for State Security, the GDR's infamous secret police. If East Germany had a soul in the eyes of the West, this was the part everyone liked to point to. After the fall of the wall, citizens stormed Stasi offices, seizing files before agents could burn them. Rooms filled with shredded paper still warm from the machines testified to a system hoping, too late, to hide its tracks. And inside those beige, dust-filled folders lay millions of lives. Friendships broken, marriages strained, careers destroyed, dreams quietly strangled. When the files were released, people found out that their neighbors had spied on them, their coworkers, sometimes even their spouses. There was no elegant way to process such revelations. Some forgave, some confronted, some never spoke again. Healing was not straightforward. Truth rarely is. And yet the decision to open the files was crucial. Because if the wall had taught the world anything, it was that secrecy is a kind of prison too, just one without concrete. Meanwhile, the two Germanys moved toward reunification. On October 3rd, 1990, less than a year after the wall fell, East Germany ceased to exist as a sovereign state. It was absorbed into the Federal Republic,
not by conquest, but by willing dissolution. And while fireworks again illuminated the Berlin sky that night, there was a somber note beneath the celebration. A country was being reborn, yes, but another was disappearing. Identities forged over 40 years don't vanish just because a legal document says so. Still, reunification brought new life to Berlin. The city began transforming at a pace that felt almost surreal. Construction cranes dotted the skyline, their silhouettes crossing like mechanical giants against the gray northern clouds. Abandoned factories became art studios, crumbling apartment blocks became cultural centers, and in the vacant lots where the wall once stood, wildflowers grew, bright, stubborn, and defiantly alive. Everything was changing, and yet the echoes of division remained quietly in the shadows. Even today, if you walk through Berlin at night, when the streets are calm and the city settles into its insomnia, you can still feel the trace of that division. Not as pain, not as fear, but as memory. A reminder that walls can fall, but the echoes of their presence linger in the things people whisper, in the directions they glance without thinking, and in the humor that still separates Aussies and Wessies just enough to keep dinner conversations interesting. But of all the legacies left by the Berlin Wall, perhaps the greatest is the lesson it offered the world, quietly, almost shyly, that no system, no regime, no ideology is eternal. Even the most immovable structures can crumble when people decide they have waited long enough. The wall fell because it was built on fear, and fear, like concrete, cracks when the pressure becomes too great. In the end, the fall of the Berlin Wall was not just a political event, it was a human one. It was about tired parents wanting a different future for their children, about young people hungry for meaning, about old men realizing that time was running out. It was about the simple, unstoppable force of human desire, unimpressed by ideology, unimpressed by borders, unimpressed by the arrogance of governments that believed they could keep people apart. History rarely gives us happy endings, but on that cold night in November 1989, it gave us something close. Not perfect, not painless, but undeniably beautiful. And as the decades pass, as Berlin continues to rebuild and reinvent itself, the wall remains, gone physically, yet present symbolically, as a reminder that divisions need not be permanent, and that even the darkest chapters can end with people crossing bridges they were once forbidden to see.
A city without a wall. And so, here we are, at the quiet end of a very loud century. The Berlin Wall, once a jagged scar of concrete and ideology, now lives mostly in memory. Small fragments behind glass, sold in souvenir shops, or sitting on someone's mantelpiece next to a dusty houseplant. Time, in its typical passive-aggressive way, has smoothed the sharp edges. Tonight, as we drift into the final moments of this story, imagine the city as it is now. Berlin, at 2 a.m., because of course it has to be 2 a.m., is a strange combination of sleepless and serene. The streets hum with that particular European glow where lamplight pools on wet cobblestones like melted gold. A cyclist passes by, whispering through the cool air. Somewhere in the distance, a late train clatters over metal tracks. And if you stand very still, you might, just might, hear the faint echo of something old, something brittle collapsing under the weight of human hope. It's not the wall itself you're hearing, no. It's the echo of an era ending. The wall's fall didn't just split a stone structure. It split open the entire 20th century, letting the world breathe in a new kind of oxygen, free from the heaviness of old fears. It reminded everyone that even the grand narratives, the Cold War, the iron ideologies, the rigid lines drawn across maps, are all built by people. And if people can build them, people can bring them down. Preferably without pouring quite so much concrete next time. Even now, the memory of that night in November 1989 lingers like warm breath on a frozen window.
Crowds cheering, families reunited, strangers hugging as if they'd known each other for years. A world glued to televisions, holding its breath collectively, then exhaling in the shape of fireworks. It felt like history wasn't happening to people, it was happening with them. A rare moment where everyone participated, simply by witnessing. And if you walk along the path where the wall once stood, today a gentle line of bricks tracing the old boundary, you won't find any guards, no barbed wire, no watchtowers glaring down. Instead, you'll see joggers and dog walkers, tourists with backpacks too large for their own good, street artists spraying color where there was only gray. Life has filled the void the wall left behind, as it always does, as it always will. But the lesson remains, glowing quietly beneath the surface. Walls don't last. They can intimidate, they can imprison, they can divide, but eventually they fall. Either with a bang, or, as in Berlin's case, with a confused announcement at a press conference, followed by thousands of people doing what people do best, ignoring instructions. The end of the Berlin Wall marked the end of more than just a political chapter. It marked the end of an era built on suspicion, on the assumption that humanity must always live in fear of itself. The wall represented the idea that people must be kept apart to keep peace. Its fall showed the opposite, that peace often begins with people reaching out, climbing over, crossing through, refusing to stay divided. And maybe, in the soft hours of the night, when Berlin is half asleep and the wind drifts through the open spaces where the wall once loomed, you can almost feel the city remembering. Not with anger, not with sorrow, but with a strange, deep gratitude. Because it survived, because it changed, because something that was once meant to last forever proved that nothing built on fear truly can. So, as we close this long, late-night story, let's leave the city as it is. Awake, healing, imperfect, beautiful. A reminder that history is not a straight line, but a mosaic, made of broken pieces that somehow fit together when enough hands reach in to help. And if you ever find yourself walking through Berlin, pause at one of those remaining fragments of the wall. Touch it. Feel its cold, rough surface. Then step back and look around. The empty space where the rest of it used to stand is the real monument. A monument to resilience, to hope, to the quietly stubborn belief that tomorrow can be better than yesterday. This has been The Sleepless Historian. Thank you for staying up with me tonight. And remember, no matter how tall or heavy a wall may seem, history has a habit of turning it into dust. Good night.